I'm here speaking to you from unceded territory of the Arapaho, the Apache, the Cheyenne, the Ute, Shoshone, and about 48 other tribes and peoples who have, to whom this place has been home, a place of healing, trade, commerce, and ceremony. And I would like to welcome my friend Renee M Chacon. Renee is a writer, educator, danzante Azteca, a Chicana activist, and most importantly, a mother of 2 sons. She's an indigenous woman of Dene Azteca descent, and she's fighting for future generations and committed to relating climate justice to social justice. She is also, I can say personally, someone that I admire very much, and has been one of the most patient and open people in helping me as a white man aspiring to be a good ally and accomplice. So I'd just like to welcome Renee and turn this over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Raz. Clasokamati omateo, clasokamati atatonatiu, clasokamati tonantinkleli, clasokamati abuelitos y abuelitas, and all the ones that came before and all the little ones to come. My name is Renee M Chacon, as you heard. I'm youth program coordinator at Spirit of the Sun and co-founder with my sister, Micaela Ironshell Dominguez, Women from the Mountain. We do transformative art education and healing circles. I work at Spirit of the Sun mainly in cultural resilience and equity, and what that really means in education, what that means in environmental justice legislation, and what that means for social justice directly. I've been marching in social justice movements since I was about 3. I danced as a mestizo, now what they call ballet folklorico. And now I am a samadora in danza azteca. I am the name Mexica, which is Navajo and Mexicana, and I'm also a little bit Filipina. So I'm a mixture of a lot of Pueblo Chicanos of this space. And I identify in my self-determination and my identity as Chicana and indigenous in my cultural roots in that way. And I'm very lucky because I was raised in the Denver area where I've been loved by my community to use this resilience in my identity through some of the worst adversities in my life. So now I bring it back to my community in these ways, in education, in cultural resilience, and in fighting specifically in environmental justice. I've been testifying for now years against Suncor in Commerce City. I live in Commerce City. And my husband also, he served in the Navy as a nuclear engineer for 10 years. So we've traveled all over the US, specifically fighting for and around Indigenous rights and justice. And it's incredibly important to highlight that acknowledgement is the first beginning step, but really it goes to allies and accomplices to understand what redistribution of narrative and redistribution of wealth really is to decolonize our spaces of white supremacy and predatory capitalism, which is now harming us all in environmental public endangerment, frankly. So that goes directly to line 3. That is an environmental public endangerment harming indigenous communities first. So decolonize to understand cultural resilience, what is sacred and sovereign, even sovereign is just an English word, and to support indigenous communities to reclaim land and wealth and redistribution to fight against racism from our own self-determination. So I'm gonna just jump right on in. Please listen today with intention. Remove all distractions, get a beverage, get some note-taking stuff, center yourself most of all, and notice your intent. Lean towards impact though. Practice active listening from here on out. That means listen for understanding, not just response. And call in new lessons and perspectives. Just listen to what I have to say. I'm not shaming anyone for being white. I'll get to that later because white only exists in colonized spaces. And most of all, everyone's a teacher and everyone's a learner. So I ask just that you put it in the chat. How do you interact with your environment daily? I'll give a little mini story of myself. I, every day, wake up and have taught my sons, who are now 10 and 7, to get a glass of water, to pray with that water, and to sage themselves off. And that is how they set their intention every day. I did this way before COVID. And now during COVID, it has actually brought us together as a family. We use our traditional language, and they've been able to learn what our traditional language truly means. So it's another source of both resiliency, education, and just expansion of their identity. That is how we just interact with just the small aspects of our environment daily. Other aspects are we actually work in bringing mycelium to disproportionate communities harmed again by Suncor. So now teaching my children literally how to clean and help the soil and what that really means to remove toxins from the nitty gritty details of it. So that's just my mini story of self. And I ask all of you to take those accounts of your mini biosphere to the outer biosphere of how you interact with your environment daily. I'm gonna go play in the chat for a minute to see some of the answers. Oh, I love them. Some of them are, I do deep breathing outside to be calm and to connect. I look at nature and admire it, and I'm amazed. Morning prayer with my community after morning farm chores. Go to the garden, collect some greens, feed chickens. I run on the dirt and give thanks for every mile. I do organic food gardening, native planting. I gaze out of my window at the beauty of nature. I make green tea, meditate, and send loving kindness to all beings. These are all forms of intention, not just prayer, but intention. And spirituality should and can be involved in a lot of our identity, but it highlights in where you should find your culture and your identity first, and respect those that have come before in the spaces that they are, because they've been displaced in cultural erasure and in physical displacement, and still to this day. So highlighting cultural erasure and cultural resiliency. Unfortunately, Indigenous communities have survived intergenerational trauma, racism, colonization, cultural genocides, and sexual violence. Our resilience lies in the generations of communities that have maintained traditional languages, cultural education, and respecting resources through known genocides. Sacred Spaces is looking at our resources as sources of life for future generations, and renaming and redistribution and land back is reclaiming our sacred spaces. Oops. So resiliency. What Spirit of the Sun, the organization that I work for, is we literally teach everything from quilling, Lakota language, Red Earth Yoga, which is free for BIPOC, by the way. Please join us every Monday and Wednesday. And specifically, again, back to mycelium projects, food bank, and a number of seedling projects as a way for resiliency, which means the power to return back to the original form. In Indigenous communities, that's tied to sacred lived traditions, our compassionate humanity and families, and the protection of community, including respect to the environment and rights to nature. Our Indigenous communities have been overcoming adversity because of the maintained traditional languages, cultural traditions, and community leaders and values through known genocides. This is something that is constantly erased and is viewed, and to my opinion, is still a continued violence. I see panels often sometimes that highlight all these amazing agriculturalists and permaculturalists and never involve an Indigenous narrative. Corn itself, what I've seen highlighted, and is Indigenous to this continent, it should at least have an Indigenous panelist. My boss alone, she's 12th generation Hopi permaculturalist and does amazing things for the community, and yet has to fight those that are considered doctors in the field when she does know more with the biosphere and how that truly connects with balance and within spirituality. That it's because of those resiliencies that we've survived some of the worst genocides, and to this day can show others what that resiliency really means. So power dynamics, why we've been robbed to begin with. We live with an invisible identity in the American identity, and we need to keep that in mind. So the first thing I ask those that want to acknowledge allies and accomplices is it's a systemic reimagining to address historical, cultural, and educational genocide and neglected narratives. The system isn't broken, it's working as designed. And that's designed to keep us BIPOC and Indigenous communities completely out. And that leaves us completely at risk because it's a way to dehumanize our communities to further steal resources. So I start with a sacred thought, why self-determination in Indigenous communities is incredibly important. And sovereignty in and of itself is not a word that really describes in our different tongues what it really means to have this way of heart. But this kind of does. Sovereignty is a state of mind, or should I say it's a state of heart. It has more to do with how we conduct our mundane actions than the heroic acts of war. Do we speak to our children in our native languages? What name leads us to the sacred? What rituals do we use to acknowledge our presence here? Tribal sovereignty is the ability to say who we are and what we are and to think for ourselves or to think for yourself. It means the ability to run our own schools and move out in the world with dignity as our own nation. Joy Harjo. Basically, we do not want a seat at the table. We want our own table for real equity analysis because of the stolen generations of wealth. We want to be able to develop our own infrastructures and know where the system and highlight where the system has failed. We are not monolithic though, and we want our own self-determination because we have diverse cultures and have the human right to now reclaim our self-determination based on our cultural traditions and resilience to reclaim our relationship to the earth without the restriction of the government's definition and miseducation in the American identity. Unfortunately, in urban spaces like Denver, and I know I had to deal with, including myself, but I was very lucky to be involved within my cultural community, is this imposter syndrome. I'm Renee M Chacon. I am rarely, unless it was in Chicano studies and American Indian studies, which I also got a double major in my degree for my first bachelor's, was to learn about my own culture. But during that time, Colorado was colonized by KKK spaces and by over 40 treaties that were never honored for the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. So I had no hope by the time I went to CU to have anything representing me, which makes you feel like an imposter in your own homelands. And imposter syndrome is deeper than the ability to compete with others in skills and or knowledge, whether it's cultural or otherwise. In Colorado, we need to be real allies and accomplices and support mixed Indigenous communities because we have Black Indigenous communities, we have Filipino mixed Indigenous communities, we have many mixed Indigenous communities, especially Mexica and Chicano, that challenges our representation. It can manifest as colorism, exclusion, and isolation from a cultural identity with no systemic representation. And this contributes to behavioral, mental, cultural, and community fragmentation. And in Colorado, that can mean death for whole communities' representation because we are continuing to be choked out socioeconomically and flushed out both ways by particulate pollution. So what's community? Acknowledgement is just the beginning. We need to acknowledge that colonial power dynamics often do play out in harmful ways when it comes to cross-cultural relationships between whites or the white identity and the traditions of marginalized cultures. Representation matters more without appropriation, but appreciation of communities to speak without their narratives being hijacked from them. Focus on the power dynamics that is fragmented and excluded BIPOC from narratives, affluence, and equity. Again, the system is not broken, it is working as designed. So this is where we need allies and accomplices like you all. We need you to listen. We need you to learn, again, that active listening without the response. Educate yourself on miseducation, on the miseducation and misinformation, and acknowledge that is the American identity. If you truly had known, you wouldn't have known, or you would have known that Colorado was colonized by 40 treaties. And I can show even on a different slide, because I've done so many presentations on it, just 10 treaties between 1840 and 1886 that completely kicked out the Ute, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho, and why they're in Wyoming and Oklahoma. So find that information too, and show solidarity by highlighting the information and infrastructures that should know that and be teaching for the next 7 generations. and be thoughtful about that. Allies are important and essential. We need people who are willing to make statements and speak truth, especially when they're leaders in the community and already hold those platforms and ability to access stakeholders. So this is where accomplices come in. Accomplices are also important and essential. We need people who are willing to make sacrifices and take action under their leadership of and in solidarity with communities that have already been impacted by racism and other forms of marginalization. Like I said, I deal with mixed Indigenous communities, both urban and rural, and we will never be the same after COVID. We now have elders that will never come back. We have complete cultural erasure, and we continue to. Can you imagine what line 3 will do? So focus on power dynamics. What is fragmented and excluded BIPOC from narratives, affluence, and equity? An ally will mostly engage in activism by standing with an individual or group in a marginalized community. Go to those marches, but stand on those city council meetings too. An accomplice will focus more on dismantling the structures that oppress that individual or group, and such will work by directing that to stakeholders in the marginalized group. Yes, that does sometimes mean being physically protected. And this is where I give a shout out to Raz. There are so many like Raz and so many other white accomplices and allies that have completely helped me at marches and even physically protected me. Not to mention, have helped with funding in other spaces. And even right now, Spirit of the Sun, we operate food bank 4 to 5 times a week for families, including no contact delivery, which is really hard during COVID, and to our houseless community and relatives the best that we can. And we still don't even have a stable property, but that's not going to stop us. But we still need that investment to know that this isn't, equity is not charity. So I ask you to think for yourselves. What is your story of self? What values do you have? What are your experiences? Why do you do what you do? Why are you on this call? Why are you listening to this? What is the story of us in the United States right now, in the American identity, even in the world? And who shares our values? What is our collective experiences? And what is our shared vision for the next 7 generations at the least? And most of all, what's the story of now? What urgent challenges do we face? We know it is line 3. This is public endangerment. And extractive industries hold personhood since like 1886. They should hold moral personhood and be tried for environmental crimes and violence when they're committed on public land and people, especially Indigenous people. We can no longer be harmed with particulate pollution, and we can no longer be harmed by the American identity dehumanizing us to that degree anymore. And what choice can we call upon others to make? This is where allies and accomplices are incredibly crucial. So for a moment, this is a lot of information, and I understand it. So I want you all to focus on these for just a moment. I'm also going to do a quick meditation because this is a lot. We're talking about genocide. And like I said, white exists in colonized spaces. If you hadn't given us a name of Navajo or Mexica or or Chicano or Hispanic or so many other spaces, we wouldn't still be in detention centers or other spaces where we have to be resigned. So if you've already been excluded to a white identity, where are you denying your indigeneity and your cultural resilience and traditions to dehumanize us? And I ask you to truly invest in your story of self, to connect back to what is important to your humanity, to recognize the story of us and the story of now. So climate justice and social justice go hand in hand. They're 2 sides of the same coin. I've learned this all my life because I've grown up in both polluted spaces and the war on drug spaces, which was basically the war on BIPOC. Environmental movements need to know not our saviors for Black communities, Indigenous communities, people of color. Though I don't speak for all, I want to highlight that. But we know how to save ourselves in these spaces because we know where we failed. And there's a lot of spaces that disproportionate communities to this day have to deal with different costs to healthcare, to public services, to a lot of things that we don't foresee that still know where the system is failing. So again, really reach out to those communities and highlight their narratives because we know where the system is impacting us now. I do not see a delegation for the four-leggeds. I see no seat for the eagles. We forget and we consider ourselves superior, but we are, after all, mere part of creation, and we must consider to understand where we are. We stand somewhere between the mountain and the ant, somewhere and only there is part and parcel of creation. Chief Orion's lines. I say this because I need us to remember we are part of our biosphere and that we've already stolen and unfortunately had stolen from us. We've been born in pollution, an imbalance of future resources and sources of life. So we need to check ourselves and we need to realize that we still need to do a lot of work in sacrificing for 7 generations. So dismantle white supremacy. See where there's marginalization, misinformation, miseducation, targeting, and white saviorism, including here in Colorado, in narratives, in spaces. That's why we're doing a lot of renaming campaigns with tribes and what that really means, because it does center down to environmental racism. It doesn't only threaten lives, longevities, and futures, but is also often an attempt to fundamentally eliminate Indigenous culture and traditions from the American demographics itself. Environmental racism in the case of Indigenous Americans must be acknowledged. Insidious form of genocide, including gentrification, lack of affordable housing in urban spaces, combined with historically degraded land and resources, both of our air quality, of our land quality, of our quality of life, all the way to the reservations we were drive to. This is racism down to the very core, because this is land that we hold more sacred than you. The term environmental racism came to connote all minorities and communities of color who across the US are equally and disastrously affected by policies involving their access to clean air, water, and non-contaminated land. I always say Indigenous rights are human rights. Missing and murdered Indigenous women and peoples need to be fought against, and Black lives matter. All of these are different crucial narratives and so many more that all need to equally dismantle to all of white supremacy that has culturally erased all of us from the American identity and affluence and equity. So environmental racism is almost purely by design on the local, state, and federal levels, despite discrimination against these communities being illegal and against standards of international human rights laws. This is why we need allies and accomplices, and why allies and accomplices need to understand that if it's us today, it's you next in your generations, because that's what predatory capitalism does. So transform by giving representation, acknowledging, and protecting your communities and our communities together. The importance of recognizing the rights of Indigenous people to use, own, and control their traditional territories and to protect their ancestral knowledge and skills is crucial. Representation matters. Self-identification as members of a distinct Indigenous cultural group and recognition of this identity by others and leaders of BIPOC. We need to have our own self-determination. Land acknowledgement of stolen land. Collective attachment to geographically distinct habitats or ancestral territories in the project areas or in areas, to the natural resources in these habitats and territories. Right now, there is a renaming campaign that you can support, including in the Clear Creek County, is Mount Evans. He is responsible for the Sand Creek Massacre, and S Mountain, which stands for Squaw Mountain. It is a sexually derogatory term against Indigenous women. If you would like to support, please go to @spiritofthe.sun on our Instagram, and please write letters, because these are real spaces. They also do coincide with extractive industries that stole that space. So can you imagine an extractive industry naming something called Squaw Mountain and missing and murdered Indigenous women? This has been happening since Columbus. So we need to realize that it's more than just land acknowledgement, but of stolen land narratives and incredible environmental harm and violence. So transform education, learn the cultures, learn how we need to have our own cultural resilience influenced in economic, social, and political institutions that are separate of those of dominant society and cultures. And most of all, let us protect our own cultural traditions for real equity in every form, from Indigenous languages to no more Indigenous houseless relatives, to most of all, affordable housing and other spaces, including access to healthcare after COVID, universal healthcare, and truly understanding platforms and sharing them what it means to heal us all in the end. My husband gave one of the best metaphors I've ever heard, and I actually use it a lot with my kids. And he's a gardener. He's a really great gardener. And he always says that if you take care of the weakest of your garden, the other plants end up growing stronger. That's true for society. If you take care of those that are weakest, those that are harmed, those that need your help, the rest of society can only flourish. So please protect those and offer translation and decision-making spaces, allowing for people to speak in any language that creates comfort and inclusivity. For renaming those spaces, the Ute and the Cheyenne and the Arapaho have proposed potentially Blue Sky Mountain and Owl Woman Mountain. I would like to also see those names in their languages. So this is when I open it up for Q&A for those that would like to offer a story of yourself. And most of all, how will you be a good ancestor? You're a living ancestor now. Allies and Accomplices is a way for you to show your future generations what it really meant and what it really means to stand in unity against spaces like Line 3 or any form of extractive industry that has become predatory for Indigenous or any community. So I asked Raz to hop back on and open it up for a Q&A to those that would like to, brave souls, answer how will you be a good ancestor?
Thank you so much, Renee.
I would say helping our non-human brothers and sisters to get through this bottleneck of like really harsh times with like so many humans covering the surface of the earth and it being so hard to find space to live and complex worlds of plants to live in and water to drink and food. And so helping them to get through so that future generations have better company.
Thank you. I agree. We don't always have every right to every space on the earth. And we have to remember that rights to nature also means respecting them.
Should I ask my question? I can ask mine. So I'm attending this as I'm an independent journalist and I'm planning on going to Minnesota in March to cover some of the direct actions. And it's been a while since, been a few years since I've covered Indigenous spaces in particular, and especially direct actions. And I would love to hear sort of what the best journalism looks like to you, the journalism that is really allied with the people most affected in these spaces, and just any suggestions for how to best tell these stories when, you know, it is, you know, I'm a white woman and, you know, my publication it's just me. So yeah, any advice possible?
Objectivity. In all honesty, my background's actually in journalism too. I used to write here in Colorado, if y'all remember the Rocky Mountain News ages ago in the Daily Camera. But in all honesty, don't hijack their narratives. Being able to be on the front lines and understand those that are sacrificing so much to again, protect future generations. And that isn't always the pretty picture that we try to set up of the perfect activist. Sometimes that's the person that's fighting to keep their sobriety and help their community the best that they can. And being able to relate those very real and vulnerable stories, but not just for the sake of, again, just that survivorship of genocide, but for legitimate resiliency and equity for leadership in the infrastructures we should have always had. So being able to highlight the resilient makers, the youth protectors, those that are there in every facet is incredibly important. I I personally think it's going to be really crucial to understand and to hone, especially for nonviolent direct action and being with a journalism background, guerrilla journalism. What does that really look like in those spaces to provide real objectivity? Sometimes it does look like a war zone in America, unfortunately. And that's sad. And but that's what it looks like for indigenous communities, and that's what it is. And that's why the Navajo Nation has been going generations without water. So really understanding it is a war zone for reservations, and it's always been a war zone for reservations. And to highlight why we even have leaders in those spaces and why they need to speak is going to be key, because again, like I said, they're going to know where certain spaces have failed. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. The war zone analogy in particular is very helpful, and I think it's cool that you have a journalism background too.
It's been a while. Any other questions of those that want to hop on or talk about being a good ancestor? Because then we could go into the exercise of the story of self. I like to do the hands-on stuff more proactively, or more if we were live.
Renee, I have a question that's come up for me a lot in this work recently, in particular, as a nonviolent direct action trainer. I've heard kind of a counter narrative from folks that has risen up like around all of the conflict, around all of the resistance this summer around the Black Lives Matter movement. And one thing that I've seen is some hijacking of narratives, which is really upsetting, and some folks saying things like, and I have to specify that I've heard this mostly from aspiring allies or accomplices, that we're facing like a new level of violence or something like that, and so you can't fight fire with water. You have to fight fire with fire, in other words. And I was just wondering, from your perspective, how do you feel about that, and nonviolent resistance versus violent resistance?
That's a great question, and it's one I'll always struggle with, frankly, myself. I grew up in movements myself, my parents and my siblings and my husband as well, for generations, for about 3 generations, and we've seen violent spaces already. Even my uncle was part of Guardian Angels at that time to keep safe space from gangs fighting each other, and what that really meant to be peacemakers is old Chicano viejitos trying to keep that space for us so that we could practice mestizo and Azteca danza without being shot at. So I understand when you want to rise up with anger and that same type of reaction that you've been given. But again, I have children in this world. I've given 2 children in this world, and I teach children in this world. And I am here as a life giver in my identity. And my honest answer and opinion is going to be, then pick your side. Because in all honesty, you have to please keep in mind that we're trying to protect for life giving for future generations. And that is going to have to be a loving space, a compassionate space The best warriors and the strongest warriors are the ones that, yeah, they're fierce. They're beautifully fierce, but they're able to protect their space with that compassion that if they need to be fierce, then yes, they'll be fierce. But most of all, they're holding their space because they can move that space, they can bring that food, they can hunt that within balance again, and preserve as sources of life. Again, life-giving. And you know what? Water is life. Learn from that. Water has living memory. So, and you can look all of that up with every type of biochemist and bioscience that we work with them as well too. A lot of times, for especially with Shannon, my boss. But in all honesty, it has to come from those that are fiercely compassionate warriors that need to be life givers, because it's easy to die for a cause and it's a hell of a lot harder to live for one. From my experience, I have lost my sister, I have lost my brother, I have lost so many to the movements, lost so many to gang wars. I've seen those shot in front of me. And you really want to go there, I suppose you can. And we already get that as it is from police in such a wrong and horrible and ugly way. So to become an oppressor is really not an option for me, because I don't want to be one. And I'd rather see those create unity and life-giving spaces, because like I said, it's a hell of a lot harder to commit to living for the future generations. So that's just my opinion.
Thank you so much. That was beautifully said.
I think there's a question in the chat that looks important. So this is not my question, but I'm just reading it from the chat. It says, beyond the ideological, internal, and interpersonal, can you please speak more to institutional change? How can we tangibly create land back in Indigenous governance and peacemaking?
Oh, thank you for asking this. Property, we honestly need property. Equity is not charity. I work a lot against, we speak against, not against, but on things for CDPHE. I work in environmental justice legislation and defining what that really means of equity analysis. And again, that means equity analysis in every institution. If you're for teaching alone, for educational institutions, to this day, we're still taught about Kit Carson as a friend to Native Americans. He's not. He actually had a Navajo child bride, and he's responsible for the longest walk of the Navajo. And yet we still have Kit Carson here. Teaching on an educational front means introducing these forms of cultural education into education. That means redistribution of wealth, ultimately reimagining, relearning, eventually, hopefully, land back. Because then you start assessing where stolen wealth and stolen resources have harmed those communities in health and quality of life. So here in Denver, we are constantly not represented on any type of legislative level. And we're still, honestly, to this day on CNN called something else. So being able to fight for those properties, for whether it's a nonprofit, whether it's supporting Denver Indian Health and Family Resources, or so many other spaces, but looking what it really looks like to let Indigenous and BIPOC communities have consistent and meaningful, for generations, affordable housing, access to healthcare. In Commerce City alone, we have some of the worst particulate pollution, and yet they removed a lot of school nurses way before COVID. This was like 2-3 years before COVID. And we already have issues with universal healthcare. So to not have these children that are in some of the worst sacrifice zones in the nation, we score the worst on all counties, including for the American Lung Association. That just shows you no real equity for communities, including immigrant communities, that are being harmed directly. So supporting on those platforms, representing in those platforms, going to those city council meetings, like I said, is another form of legitimate nonviolent direct action protesting. And going, most of all, not just to those protests, but helping buy those properties around town. We're not the only community that's been harmed by gentrification. The entire East Side used to be a Black community. And we need to remember that. And there's a reason that it historically was, and there's a reason it historically contributed to the Colorado identity in a beautiful way. So being able to help support what constantly is cultural erasure in our infrastructures and our systems is sharing financial and stakeholding contributions and fiscal sponsorship to those spaces and funding directly, honestly. And then also assessing where there isn't real equity to health, life, and the ability to thrive. So those are just some of the things. We could go into it so many other ways. Like I said, we do mycelium if you want to come volunteer. We do food bank if you're a real hardcore volunteer. So if you really want to be there for communities, it is hands-on every day. I just did a 75-pack outreach with Native American Housing Committee and Johnny McCraggy, who's an amazing human being. Shout out to her. And we did, and Jenna Manchego, we did including bus tickets for the houseless community, where we provided at least a few quick meals in there, some warm food, and 75 packs that we could just hand out to some of the worst areas we've been seeing. And that was just a Band-Aid for a weekend. So, I mean, it's a lot of work.
Thank you so much. I see Brenna, you have your hand up.
Hi, yes. And I'm trying to be careful about how I phrase this question, but I'm wondering if you could speak to or offer some insight into, so especially around the Line 3 and other anti-pipeline actions. I think it's really important to follow the leadership of those most directly affected, particularly Indigenous leadership. And it's, I think right now it's pretty clear that there are a lot of Indigenous leaders calling for people to come up and support. But it's not always like a unified, it doesn't mean that every single Indigenous person who lives in that area is excited about us coming. And not every single Indigenous person in that area is opposed to the pipeline. And so I'm wondering if you could offer any insight into how to navigate, like, how to show up in a way that's supportive and not trying to necessarily take sides. And like, as a non-Indigenous person, I how to navigate which voices to listen to, or how to be respectful, knowing that it's not always like what's the word, a monolithic voice that's asking for our assistance or asking for allyship. Yeah. Again, sorry if the words were jumbled. I'm trying to ask it in a way that doesn't like create more division even. So it's a little just
comfortable. I could tell you're nervous. No, take a deep breath. We're good. In all honesty, it's these hard questions that need to be asked. I'll be frank, not all Indigenous communities are like, and some Indigenous communities have supported extractive industries. There's a reason that we fragmented and in some ways betrayed and harmed each other. So I would say go to the Indigenous communities that are there to give life-giving and highlight where this is a public endangerment for Indigenous communities. This is still an extractive industry. So it comes to picking an allyship side that way, because this is where we're preserving for the next 7 generations. And that in and of itself is where Indigenous communities are aligned internationally. Like, that's an Indigenous concept, is to be concerned as our resources and sources of life. I don't say don't take care of other Indigenous communities, but I'm assuming they're probably already well taken care of by extractive industries. And if not, then I would hope that they are concerned about how they can transfer over to more sustainable industries. And maybe there can be bridging there one day. I would highlight those that are already doing the work. I know Honor the Earth and those that are Stop Line 3 there's a reason that those specific organizations are highlighted too, especially Winona LaDuke, and those in those spaces, that's their homelands. They need direct, whether it's financial, like again, that fiscal support, or that physical support. If you're going there, what I mean by hijacking narratives is don't appropriate wanting to join ceremonies or in anything like that. Though I do hope you have spiritual enlightenment, a line 3 thing might not be the thing for a ceremony at that time, unless it's to support in prayer and intention, which intention means walking the walk and talking the talk too. So that means if you're going to camp there, please don't be wasteful. Please be mindful of others there. Please do not romanticize, mysticize, or in any way take over the same type of stereotypical information. I always honestly say, if you have a question, just honestly ask. There's even to this day that I can ask aunties, and yeah, they might yell at me, but they'll give me a real answer. And that's okay. We'll live through that kind of thing. And that's what it really means to be uncomfortable in these spaces. And I deal a lot with it. That's why, in all honesty, you can ask me the hardest question, and I open it to others too. You can ask me these questions because I deal with this a lot and I have my whole life. And I've been called every name you could think of doing it. So I say, most of all, navigate with respect and just class to your own identity too.
Thank you. Yes, my name's Peter. I wanted to ask, I'm organizing a fundraiser for the Stop Line 3 campaign over here in Pennsylvania and Susquehanna land, and just asking for tips on how to not, on the best way to message it and to make sure to center the Indigenous leadership, whether that be through specific videos or writings that are already in existence or images, et cetera, in terms of branding my event and making sure that it is supporting and not co-opting.
Great question. Any and all ways that you can raise funds to support Line 3 and those that are protecting that space, please do. I always say, compensate any Indigenous community that you involve or any organizations that you involve with just a compensation. If they helped in any narrative or in any kind of graphics, please give administration fees to local organizations. If they help in any kind of way to speak on panels to bring out information, again, please give them their due compensation for their narratives, because that is sometimes just work just to educate and then to actually do the work itself. So compensate, please compensate Indigenous elders, leaders, those in their spaces, because yeah, sometimes there's some that are literally houseless that'll still go to Line 3 or in other ways still present themselves in a really good way for their community. In other ways, I would ask that you, again, go to those that are already doing the work. Why reinvent the wheel? So go directly to maybe organizations that have already might have raised those resources, might have helped with those organizers, or might have already had those spaces, and directly give your funds to them. Sometimes that's all you need to do. That could have helped them with entire programs or entire spaces. So things like that, like being mindful where you can just, I always tell people, where you don't step on others' toes, and being able to ask those questions of just highlighting the Indigenous community. Find out where your local Indigenous community is too, that might align with these narratives as well, where you can work together to highlight as an ally and accomplice, maybe their narratives in that space as well, because it might coincide with another form of an extractive industry too. So keeping all that in mind, it ends up being kind of small, but then big really fast. Did that answer your question? If you're raising funds, I'd be cautious of GoFundMe because they do charge a fee, matters on how big it gets. But if you're raising funds, be very intentional and specific what you're raising them for. Are you raising them for operational costs for other organizations? Are you helping them to provide transportation? Are you helping them to provide food? Are you helping them to provide those type of things? Be very specialized in the type of funds that you're raising to support those spaces as an ally and accomplice. That's what I mean by stepping on their toes. They might already have enough food, or they might not already have enough clothing. So where are you contributing to? I remember hearing from those that went to Standing Rock, like Mika and Tomas from the International Indigenous Youth Council, that there was such a surge of clothes that they ended up just putting it in a pile, because it got to the point that they couldn't really divide what was men's and women's and things like that, because they might not have that capacity to take care of that type of thing. So again, if you're going to raise funds or things, please be very intentional and specialized, if that helps elaborate a little bit more. And if you're going to go there directly, please be intentional and specialized. If you have a specialization, align yourself to those that are in those space that may be able to use your specializations. Did that help?
That does help. Thank
Oh.
you very much. And I saw other people note in the chat, yes, to reach out to Stop Line 3 for specific like image graphics, videos, pre-written text things. So I'm not trying to write it myself. So yeah, that's definitely what I'm looking for. And thank you for all the other details as well. It's very helpful.
Oh, that's a really great question. I'm hearing about the ally industrial complex that resonates with me, being counseled by fellow white allies who are unwilling to be accomplices. Can a white ally be a good ally if they're not willing to also be an accomplice? That's a great question. Matters on how far you want to go. In all honesty, you could be a good ally, but it's the difference between having an acquaintance and a friend. I mean, yeah, you're an ally. We'll get to know each other. And we might even have intercultural exchanges, but I'll never really get to know you, and you'll really never get to know me. And there's never really going to be truth and equity. And there's always going to be somewhat of a barrier. So we're not going to be fully cool. So in all honesty, I guess no, and a real accomplice understands that equity is not charity. I'm not saying support Indigenous communities because we really like to do this for fun for food bank. I'm saying that people will starve if we don't do food bank 5 times a week. And that's just our organization. And that's literally elders. One elder was hit by a car last week, had very few family members that was able to go to her. She's living in a hotel, and we barely were able to get food bank to her, and the doctors released her the next day with no pain meds. Like, it's that real on front lines, and that's just in Denver. So can you imagine line 3? So please be mindful, this is life or death for Indigenous and BIPOC communities. And equity is not charity, because this is you being able to stop environmental violence, to stop social violence now by being a real accomplice. If that covered that. Is there a distinction between the terms ally and accomplice? Yes, an ally will help represent and stand in solidarity and listen and learn. And it's almost like the first steps. It's like acknowledgement, ally, and the last step is an accomplice, because it understands directing towards stakeholding and that stolen wealth and narratives that need to be restored from the cultural erasure from disproportionate communities. And shout out to Raz's dog. I saw that. Yes, I saw that.
He hates when I give my attention to the screen instead of him.
Like a cat. Do you have any suggestions to back to the land organizing for food justice and ecological stewardship to tie the work to land back? Beautiful. Please, please, please support local, honestly, spaces like food banks and spaces in those spaces to directly hit disproportionate communities that need that food justice on the front lines right away. Other ways that you can support is in education and supporting education of food justice. If you want to reach out, we also work a lot with other organizations, both nationally and internationally, about what that really means to talk about food justice, land back, BIPOC leadership in food justice and land back, and how to truly help with that. That's a whole conversation too, sometimes by itself. So again, I would love to put my info in that. But for land back food justice organizing, yeah. I don't know if I have any suggestions. I have ways we could just keep going and doing it. The Tiawi Mashika movement. What's your thoughts about Indigenous leaders in colonial politics? Indigenous leaders deserve to be represented in colonial politics because colonial politics are all of the politics that we have, because all of the power structures have been founded on colonization. So if we don't have Indigenous leaders in colonial politics, we won't be able to have any representation in colonial politics because it's all colonial politics.
Renee, thank you for your work. My questions are interrelated. The first one has to do with violence. I get flummoxed when I think of the subject. And it's hard for me to pit nonviolent direct action with the opposite, violent action. And I think, well, it's like misplacing a pipeline, just nudging it a little bit. Is that violence? It's certainly messing with property. Is messing with property that's going to contribute to further destruction of the planet violent? So I get hung up and flummoxed by the whole subject. And I don't see it as being so able to be so reductionist, you know, violent versus nonviolent. So that's one question. The other one has to do with reparations. When educating, especially youth, you know, elementary school kids, high school kids, about treaties being violated. In your experience, in your work, is the subject of reparations interjected with treaty violations? And then I forgot my last question. Thank you.
Thank you, and good question. So for the first one, for violence, it is a violence, because for just Indigenous thought alone, that's respecting rights to nature. Nature itself is a living being. That's why we honor our self-determination down to our Mother Earth, because it coincides with our spirituality, even our scientific findings and how we respect the soil, the water retention, different things within balance in and of itself, that we know this is a living, creating, life-giving being. To harm to that degree and create imbalance that is going to be a systemic harm of possibility of it spilling, of it harming water that's irreparable for at least 2 generations. And really assessing that in and of itself becomes a violence, because then you realize the degradation that's going to harm in just those areas alone: low birth rates, cancer rates, asthma, anemia. That might not look like a violence just because they put something in the earth, but that one time of pollution or of any harm is too much harm to sacrifice those communities to, and that is violent. Because one, you're putting it in communities that are already disproportionately affected, and then they're harmed to such a degree. 2, we look at that land as more sacred than you. I've literally had elders who are rape survivors see these spaces and cry, because to them that's a violation, as if it was a woman being harmed by a man physically. That's how much we hold this land more sacred. Is women, and especially Indigenous women that I've seen, have looked at the earth as, when you cut into it for a predatory, exploitative, extractive way that causes imbalance to that degree, you are causing so much harm that is like hurting the flesh of another living being. So that's one way that it causes both a mental, behavioral, spiritual, communal, cultural violence in those communities. 2, it's that particulate pollution that is a legitimate physical violence that happens over generations. And then we don't have access to healthcare. That's not talking about the federal and state loopholes about healthcare, about education, and then the cultural erasure to even dehumanize these communities, again, in socioeconomic violence. A lot of those spaces are maintained by man camps, And again, missing and murdered Indigenous women is an issue because there's the sexual violence in those spaces, stalking goes up, domestic violence in those spaces go up, because those are all people that are helping those systems to be maintained and then prey on the local communities without any representation. Why we even have to fight for missing and murdered Indigenous women, which Deb Haaland just actually passed the No More Invisible Act. So that federal and state legal loopholes could finally work together to actually finally help for victim search and rescue, which we've been begging for decades for. And that just barely passed this year, and we still don't even have a database or even idea how to do that locally yet. And even I've been working with local jurisdictions and local, even the Denver DA, and they're asking for our help to connect to Indigenous communities. So it's a number of ways that this becomes systemic violence. And it might not be a universal experience for you, but it's very much a universal and lived experience for these communities. And, oh, and the second one, yes, honestly, I do introduce reparations because that's what it means to have redistribution of narratives and redistribution of wealth. I actually just addressed it with the charter school that I sub at, which my kids go to school with, because my son, even now, he's actually in 4th grade, but he's taught at a 7th grade, or he's at a 7th grade level, but he chooses to stay in 4th grade. And they were teaching about Kit Carson. And like I said, we are part of the Ne Navajo. And he knows about Kit Carson. So he immediately came to me, and I went to his teacher. His teacher talked to the other teachers, and now they want to do ally and accomplice training there. So being able to talk about reparations and introduce these ideas is not foreign. It's able to slowly dismantle this work little by little of going to those school districts and introducing these ideas. But again, that's why it's really important to compensate those that are doing the work. I'm not the only one doing this work. We have a whole team at Spirit of the Sun that helps do this work too. So I'm really, really grateful. These questions are good, really good questions, because they do go to a lot of why we do and why we have to do what we do.
Thank you, Renee. This is really amazing. And I'm learning so much, even after knowing you for, for a while now and working with you. Just this is a great forum. So yeah, would you like to lead us in the exercise?
So first, I want everyone to center themselves. If you can, go to a space that you could be quiet if you're not already. And for a moment, I do want you, if you can, and in your capacity, to close your eyes. So sit in a chair with your both feet planted, shoulders up, back and down. And I want you to focus on your breathing. Don't regulate it. Let it come as natural as you can, as fluid as you can. We are dealing with heavy, heavy topics, things that are triggering. And we have to approach even these spaces in a decolonized way. So I ask that you bring your intention to yourself, whatever your spirituality, we're not getting there. This is only focusing on breath. And I want you to take one deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. I want you to listen to the sounds in the room. See what farthest sound you can hear. It could be the wind. It could be sirens. It could be a dog. But I want you to focus on it. And take another deep breath. In through your nose. And out through your mouth. Now I want you to bring your awareness a little closer. And I want you to listen to the sounds in your home and in the room you're directly in. Do you hear any sounds in the next room? Those laughing? Do you hear anything creaking or the wind moving windows or doors? Do you hear nothing at all? And I want you to breathe one really big deep breath in through your nose and fill up your stomach all the way you can. And let it all out. And any tension that was triggering you, let it go. Let you relax your jaw. Let it fall open. And bring your awareness to your body. Listen to any sounds of yourself. Do you hear your heart beating? Your breath restoring to its normal breath, space, balance. Or do you hear nothing at all? I do this exercise only so we can all remember first medicine is our breath, is the ability to speak for ourselves. And most of all, to remember the power of your breath is life-giving, literally to give you life. And to speak for yourself is life-giving. And to allow others to speak for themselves is life-giving. So the last one is just for all the brave souls that is curious to do, because I just like doing this within meetings. I'm going to put the story of self. And I would like just one person for each one to be able to relay their answers for one of each of these on our way out. After hearing this presentation, after thinking for yourself, after feeling for a moment, and us even now collectively being able to focus on intention. Just one brave soul, whoever I suppose responds to the chat first or raises their hand first. I'll let Raz choose. One for each. Story of self, story of us, and story of now. Focused on line 3. Tomas Hoy. Please, if you don't mind unmuting yourself.
Yeah. I guess the reaction to just one question is, why do I do what I do? As an activist who focuses on the environment and ecological degradation and everything that goes along with it, I do it because I feel a weight and emptiness in, like a physical weight and emptiness in my chest on a regular basis, and a very deep sadness as to what's happening to the planet and the people that live on it. And I couldn't be me if I didn't do something.
Thank you for sharing that. Very pure truth. And thank you. Story of us. Another brave soul. Kevin. Guyan, I believe.
Yes. I'd like to share my values, that I believe that the root of our problems are firmly connected with colonialism and the negative effects of the colonial minded. And it's happening today in Canada, in across Canada, we have actions that are underway. People being arrested, youth being arrested in Vancouver on last week. We've got land back struggles in Ontario where their colonialists are building upon Indigenous reservations. We have the Micmac on the East Coast are having lobster fishermen burning each other's ships. You know, with colonialism is happening in third world countries, in first world countries. It's happening everywhere. It's completely linked to the climate crisis. And colonialism is so strong that even the global supply chain of everything that we buy is built by the hands of people of color from other countries. So we are all acting colonial. We need a general strike. We need matrilineal leadership. We need treaties that include the earth with the rest of us. In the Mohawks have the two-row wampum from the Iroquois, the two-row wampum from 1613 between the Dutch and the Mohawks, the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee people. We travel in the same waters, but we don't impact each other's vessels. But that treaty needs to be redone. We need a treaty that includes Mother Earth. How do we do that, Renee? How does a stupid grandson from a white settler, how does he do that?
No, Meto, I hear you.
Thank you.
Just so you all know, the Constitution is based on Iroquois law. How it highlights human rights is literally based on Iroquois law. Believe it or not. You can look it up. I don't know, hermano, but we do need to look at our spaces void of colonial violence and reimagine our systems void of colonial violence. And we need to reimagine and relearn our systems void of environmental violence. Literally learning what our spaces need to look like to restore their resources. And a lot of that returns to Indigenous knowledge, because the reason I say we hold that space in a sacred way is because those spaces could have been named not only for the ceremonies that they held, but for the glaciers that they could have held, for the spaces that they could have held within seasons and within balance. And that's why they were named that, is because it was highlighted for that resource. So you respected it as a being and a right of nature that you didn't overconsume and overexploit for the sake of being predatory or overconsuming. And the reason that we do need to sacrifice and have a lot of strikes, frankly, is because we need to realize where we are being predatory in our capitalistic consumption, but can actually do something about it on the everyday now. And that is going to take a lot of enlightened and progressive and transformative minds to move forward in those spaces and start with those strikes and really go without. And it's okay to go without. And to, again, decolonize and reconnect to your own indigeneity and cultural resilience. Don't hijack others, learn yours. You're not just white. You're Swedish, you're German, you're so many other spaces that, yeah, you probably had ugly ancestors, but you had good ones too. So call on your good ancestors that lived at that time and might have colonized you first and colonized your spaces first, and realize where you've been colonized first to reconnect. That's going to be key. And look at yourself first, void of colonial violence, and then start reassessing what that looks like. We literally tried to do a campaign with youth once just to take, or actually just recently right now, it's renaming, to take pictures of themselves in Colorado and in park spaces void of colonial violence and what that looks like. And that's how we even heard so much about Mountain. It was young women that see these disgusting spaces and really don't want to anymore because how harmful that is. So I don't have all the answers, of course, to that. And of course, we can continue forever with this. But in all honesty, it is really assessing where colonial violence has harmed your own identity and is continuing to systemically harm BIPOC to this day, starting with Indigenous communities. And you're so right, Hermano. It is so overwhelming to not have allies and accomplices have come sooner, have been there for you in a way that could support and value your respect and right to humanity too. And a lot of us are mixed Indigenous, so don't feel like an imposter. Do connect to your indigeneity. Again, that's an imposter syndrome. And all of us need to understand that it is your responsibility to heal yourselves too, so that you can come in these spaces to heal these spaces as well. So that really is what it means to decolonize. So hopefully going forward, that is something we can all work with in bridging, but never outrunning each other, never playing oppression politics. This is a constant connectivity of a circle that if someone else knows more than you in a good way, let them speak first. And then if you do, may the people recognize you and have you speak first. So I hope that was a little helpful. Last one, story of now, I believe.
I could take the story of now, if that's okay. Okay. So the story of now, why now? Because we have no other choice. And I'm sorry, why now? Why now? Max is making this noise is because it's his dinner time and he's hungry. But we really have no other choice. We have no more time left to act, right? We are all seeing the effects of the climate crisis every day showing up in our lives. That we were told 10 years ago that we were going to see these things in 100 years, and then it was 50 years, and now we're recognizing that we're seeing this all right now. And you know, trainings like this are so important because not just from a moral perspective do we have to be good allies and good accomplices and to right the wrongs of the injustices of the past, but because these communities are the ones who are living in right relation with the planet and with the climate and hold this wisdom that is so important for us to learn from. And also because we have an incredible opportunity right now with Line 3. This is not the only fight in existence right now, but it is a big one. And we really do have an opportunity to win. You know, Biden has just pulled the permit on the KXL. Enbridge feels the resistance, and they have advanced their timeline, right? They're trying to get this done in 6 months. It just so happens the communities and the Anishinaabeg territory have asked for our support, and so we're mobilizing this week of action. And at the same time, on March 31st, 18 banks have $2.2 billion in loans coming to call, and we have to let them know that we want them to defund, not to double down on Line 3. And so that's why, for me, the story of now, that's what this means to me. We really do have an opportunity to make an incredible impact and to learn from and to support and to be good allies and accomplices to our Indigenous siblings.
Oh, Mato, Raz, you're definitely an accomplice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Renee.
You're
And
right. Defund, divest, dismantle.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Other ways that you can also is highlight divestment in Para, I believe. And in Canada, I believe Crestone. So divestment and learn where those extractive industries are. Learn where your unions, teachers spaces, all those spaces need to divest, and highlight them locally. That is another way to become a true accomplice, and tell them that's not where you want your money to go to. I mean, you do, if you have that privilege and you have that accessibility, please, yes, divest.
Yeah, absolutely. You said Crestone. One of the largest fracking projects in the world is being planned for about a mile or two from my home. And that's Crestone, and they are actually funded by the Canadian Pension Fund. So you nailed it. And that really ties that all together for me. Really, I feel that.
Well, we're a minute over. I thank you all for joining. I hope this was a good way to bridge, understand, advocate, support, learn, relearn, reimagine. And most of all, I'm grateful. And in any way that I can help expand this and bridge to people way better than me, because there's so many matriarchs that have been holding this space for a very long time. There's a reason I literally exist. And I'm very grateful for those that came before. So in any way that we can bridge in the little ones to come, I am truly grateful. I have two of my own. Greatest job I'll ever do in my life. So thank you all. And like I said, I'll be in any way to support stopping line 3. And I ask true accomplices to please strike and please stop line 3.
Thank you so much, Renee. I really am blessed to know you, and just to continue to work together. I look forward to that. And I just ask everyone here to please, if you're able, to come to the week of action. Cindy, if you could drop the link to the sign up form for camps in our chat. And also, we have more trainings on nonviolent direct action coming up this weekend. On Saturday and Sunday, we have a 2-part training. We're going to cover a lot of the fundamentals of nonviolent direct action, talk about line 3, talk about legal briefing and all these kinds of things. And that's going to be from 2 to 5 Central, and all of the other time zones that y'all are gonna have to figure out. And that's also in the chat. And if folks could sign up to be a part of those as well. And Renee, do you have anything else before we go that you would like to ask people to, a link to share, or places where people can donate to support your work? Yeah, please do that.
Please, if you can, go to Instagram at spiritofthe.sun. We have a lot of information discussing environmental violence, renaming things, just information about allies and accomplices and how you can support us. We do a lot of food bank. We do a lot of cultural resiliency programs, but we ultimately need funding. If you look at our GoFundMe, we have the I Still Exist campaign, which helps with, we're creating a self-defense courses, which we will be paying, compensating for young girls. We will also have houseless relatives for bus tickets. In Colorado, there is literally no affordable housing and gentrifications or even shelters. And then there's constantly housing sweeps, I think 2 or 3 last week alone. So being able to just provide bus tickets for safe haven and a way out is what we've been ultimately forced to do. So we do a lot of initiatives for grassroots, ground level things. So please look us up at spiritofthesun.org and all of our information. And that's not even talking about my amazing boss, who I also said is an 12th generation Hopi permaculturalist in the international indigenous community. So she has a number of amazing work for seedling projects and ways to preserve indigenous knowledge and indigenous seeds and indigenous ways on our land after all this. So if we're really going to dismantle white supremacy, dismantle predatory capitalism, we have to have another forum to go to. And it's elders like her that maintain that space. So please support a lot of indigenous programs and those that work, not just at but so many in Colorado. So thank you very much, Raz. So again, look us up at spiritofthesun.org on Facebook as well. Bye, y'all.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We really appreciate you. Please sign up, go to camp, join our trainings, get involved. If you can't come to camp, then do solidarity actions. We're having trainings about that too, and also and donate to the camps who are leading the charge on the front line. And yeah, please, everyone, just do whatever you can in this fight. As we talked about, this is a critical time, and we need to all do whatever we are able.